Last indicators of water quality we're going to talk about is turbidity. Turbidity is very simply the clarity of the water. If you look in this picture, you can see a lot of runoff pouring into the water, which is increasing the sediment in the water. As the sediments in the water increase, the water becomes more turbid or more unclear. Turbidity is very easy to measure, and it's measured with an object called a Secchi disc. It's an instrument that is about the size of a frisbee, has black and white design on it, and you just basically take it and you lower it in the water until you can no longer see the disc. Raise it slowly until it appears, and then you can use some numbers on the rope to be able to calibrate it. The last thing that we are going to talk about is the process of eutrophication. We've talked today about nitrates and phosphates and how they can affect our water if we get too many into it. Well, there's actually a process that you'll talk about quite a bit in 7th grade called eutrophication. It's where our water bodies receive excess nutrients, like those nitrates and phosphates, that stimulate excessive plant growth. If you look in the pictures, on the left is your normal lake, and your right is a lake during eutrophication. Essentially, what you're doing is using those nitrates and phosphates to kind of fertilize the water. And as that happens, it's going to cause a large amount of algae to bloom. As that algae blooms into the water, it starts to remove some of the oxygen, which puts a stress on lots of animals. So over time, you can see, number one, excessive nutrients from fertilizers get flushed into the land, into rivers and lakes by rainwater. Over time, number two, these plants flourish and they cause an aquatic plant growth of lots of algae and duckweed and other plants. Over time, that algae blooms. The oxygen gets depleted. The more algae that blooms, the less sunlight gets to plants on the bottom. And those plants die, and the oxygen in the water gets depleted. As things start to die in the water, those dead plants get broken down by the bacteria decomposers, and they use up even more oxygen in the water. Eventually, and sadly, the ecosystem dies. Those oxygen levels reach a point, kind of like a dead zone, where no life is possible. The fish and the organisms die. So let's take a second to think about everything we learned today. I'm going to give you a scenario, and I want you to try to answer this question. A scientist from the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, collected the following data from your pond. What conclusions can you draw after analyzing the pond? When they went to the pond, they noticed, number one, there was no shade around the pond. It got direct sunlight during the day. The depth of the pond was 7 feet deep. There's increased algae. The dissolved oxygen level was 2 parts per million, and the nitrates are reading at 8.3 milligrams per liter. I want you to take a second and answer these questions. Number one, what is the water quality? Is it good? Is it fair? Is it poor? Number two, what can you tell about the temperature? And then you'll need to explain why you think that. Lastly, I'd like to know, where do you think this pond might be located? And why do you think that? So take a minute, answer these questions, and we'll talk about them shortly.